The 13th century universe was not a flat map, it was a ladder. From the dirt, up through kings and angels, every element in medieval existence was structured by a strict, unyielding vertical hierarchy. In this worldview, perfection was measured strictly by altitude. To get closer to God, you had to move upward. You had to climb a Neoplatonic ladder, leaving the heavy, flawed material world as far beneath you as possible. In the 14th century, that ladder broke. The Black Death wiped out a third of Europe. Socioeconomic upheaval shook the feudal system, and nominalist philosophers began picking apart the logic of the church hierarchies. These overlapping crises shattered confidence in the vertical design. The intellectual focus of the era shifted. Instead of asking how high something sat in a cosmic ranking, thinkers began asking how much of a certain quality a thing actually contained. A group known as the Oxford Calculators took up this problem. They embarked on a mathematical project, attempting to successfully quantify qualitative changes, like heat, speed, or even spiritual grace, for the first time in Western history. By shifting the metric of perfection from a rigid vertical hierarchy to a quantifiable physical capacity, they solved a physics problem while accidentally building the metaphysical architecture for the modern autonomous individual. To measure these invisible qualities, the calculators developed a mathematical framework called the Latitude of Forms. This chart decomposes abstract concepts into two dimensions. The horizontal axis is longitude, representing the human subject. The vertical axis is latitude, representing the intensity of a quality. They discarded altitude, replacing it with latitude, a cartographic term for horizontal expansion. This creates a linguistic puzzle. Why would 14th century mathematicians choose a word meaning breadth to measure the intensity of a form, instead of the obvious choice, height? They chose breadth because latitude implies an internal expansion. It measures a thickening or an unfolding of a quality within a bounded body. It maps the internal scope of a subject, rather than plotting an escape route away from it. Through this specific geometry, the human body was no longer viewed as a lowly rung on a ladder to be quickly abandoned. The person became a finite, measurable canvas, designed specifically to be filled. A nominalist theologian named Durandus of Saint-Pourçain saw the implications of this new geometry and applied it directly to the mechanics of the human soul. This chart illustrates the prevailing 13th century doctrine he was arguing against, concurrentism. This was the belief that God must actively and immediately cooperate with every single microscopic action of any secondary cause. Durandus attacked this with the principle of superfluity. He argued that if God micromanages every action, the creature itself is functionally pointless. Instead, Durandus proposed mere conservationism. In this model, God creates the fundamental nature of the field and conserves its existence, but the actions and variations on the graph proceed directly and independently from the creature. By severing that divine micromanagement, Durandus granted the human creature genuine causal efficacy. The individual now possessed a latitude of power that belonged entirely to them. This required a new model of grace. An increase in charity was not God reaching down and stacking new bricks on your soul from the outside. It was the subject unfolding its own internal capacity to participate in the divine. Without the puppet strings, Durandus reconceptualized the human soul as a sovereign territory. It was an autonomous field, fully capable of generating its own independent spiritual coordinates. To accurately map this autonomous field, we rely on a specific New Testament distinction: soma, the structural body, or capacity, and sarx, the privation of the flesh. This aligns with the concept of Augustinian privation. Augustine defined evil not as a created substance, but as a lack of order, the empty holes in a sponge. This diagram shows how that theology plots onto a geometric plane. Sarx is mapped as an active deformity, a graph full of empty dips and dark voids where grace is absent. Soma, on the other hand, is the good nature. It is the baseline longitude, the physical extension and capacity created by God, which he refuses to annihilate. Sanctification in this model isn't a vertical climb out of the body. It operates like a hydraulic or pneumatic process. The Spirit fills the voids of sarx from within, smoothing out the jagged lines until the shape solidifies. Once those voids are filled, you reach the state of the integrated whole. This is the geometric condition where the Holy Spirit fully occupies the soma, reaching the absolute limits of its physical extension. The earthly capacity isn't just an obstacle to be burned away, it is the necessary vessel for receiving grace. God's objective is to completely saturate the map. This mathematical integration of the soul quickly moved out of the university and into the socio-political reality of the 14th century. A rising urban middle class, the burghers, began using this exact logic to challenge the power of the ecclesiastical hierarchy. The old feudal system relied on altitude. Your power came from a static rank. Mercantile power relied on latitude. It was built on broad trade networks, horizontal influence, and liquid capital. We see this play out historically with figures like Roman Merswin, a wealthy banker who led the Friends of God. Merswin remained a layman, completely outside the church hierarchy, but achieved immense mystical authority by utilizing his mercantile networks to buy and build spiritual retreats. This chart applies the Merton mean-speed theorem to their respective spiritual states, calculating their total grace as a measurement of geometric area, multiplying their extension by their intensity. On the left, a pope might possess a very high altitude of office, but if his personal latitude is difform, full of the jagged voids of pride and sin, his total area of grace is mathematically quite small. On the right, the burgher sits at a very low altitude of status. However, if he has achieved a uniform, fully saturated latitude, he generates a massive, solid area of grace. The calculus proved that a common merchant with a saturated soul was ontologically superior to the pope in the order of grace. The papacy's monopoly on absolute power had been dismantled by an equation. This leaves one final mechanical question. If salvation is entirely about horizontal, internal saturation, how does the soul ever achieve its heavenly elevation? The 14th century resolved this using the physics of buoyancy and natural place. They treated sarx as a form of spiritual gravity, dense, heavy, and dragging the soul downward. Grace, however, provided levity, naturally seeking the upper atmosphere. This diagram shows the final sequence. Ascension isn't an arbitrary lifting performed by an outside force. It is the unavoidable physical consequence of total internal saturation. As the heavy voids are filled with levity, the integrated soul simply rises. The tension between building the kingdom within and the final ascent to heaven is erased. The rise is exactly the physical manifestation of the internal fullness. The latitude of forms functioned as the mathematics of the incarnation. It proved that God weighs the solid mass of an integrated life, establishing a geometric architecture where the lowest among us can hold the absolute.